Um, all right. So as I said, we're going to go ahead and get started looking at the Pauline epistles this time. We have a lot of epistles to get through. It's kind of, we're right here in the New Testament. We have a lot of different epistles to look at with a lot of different occasions. Because of that, this study is, while we get at the end of it, after I give some initial advice on how to read epistles generally, this is going to kind of look like the speed run we did through the minor prophets, just because when you have this much variety of shorter books that we're reading in this chunk of our scheduled reading, I kind of just got to get through and move quickly. So hopefully that'll be useful to us. I have and my excuse for this, number one, I'm blaming Pastor Michael for not being here. I already said that. But number two, because we were in the Gospels, I've had a tendency the last few times that we've met to go a little bit over our scheduled time. This time, I promise you, I will be letting you out at 7:30 at the latest. If my goal is to get through, basically where I targeted is to get through 2nd Thessalonians. Give you at least the introduction through 2nd Thessalonians. If we don't get that far, wherever we get to by the time at 7:30, we stop. So we're not going long today. I promise you that much. But regardless, whatever we finish up to 2nd Thessalonians is where I would like to get to. We will pick back up with next time we meet in 2 weeks. So what that means is, even though I've titled this particular unit the Pauline epistles, for a couple of reasons, we won't be looking at all the Pauline epistles in detail today, but we will still have a few Pauline epistles to look at next time, as well as the general epistles. And I'll say more about what that actual distinction between Pauline and general or Catholic epistles is in a moment. So let's go ahead and get into our basics. Can I get this? I have a menu popping up. There it goes. All right, that'll give us a little bit more real estate. So what is an epistle, first of all? It's worth saying what an epistle is from the very beginning. And the word epistle does come directly from the Greek epistole, which is just a word meaning letter. This is why many times we'll just refer to the epistles as letters, because that's what they are. And we have traditions, we have general processes for how we write letters, and we have general expectations and social norms and standards for how we write anything from a handwritten letter to an email. You open up with dear so-and-so, comma, and then you get into the body of the paper, then you finish it up with sincerely, love, whatever the postscript is, and then your name. And you have that basic structure and what's expected to be in a letter. Well, one of the things we have to start out with is saying that they have the same kind of cultural norms and expectations of what would be in an epistle or a letter back in the period when the New Testament epistles were being written, during the Greco-Roman period. They would have their general expectations of this is what would be in a letter, here's how you would structure it, here's what we expect to see. And the epistles that we find in the New Testament follow that same basic convention and that same basic shape. So what that means is the bulk of the books that we have in the New Testament are actually letters that are falling in this general cultural, socially expected format of what a letter should be. And there are 21 epistles in the New Testament. That's why most of the books we have in the New Testament are actually letters. 14 of them are written by the one individual, Paul. And when I say 14 there, I'm grouping into the Pauline epistles Hebrews, which Hebrews is a little bit of a special case because a lot of people dispute whether or not Paul actually wrote Hebrews specifically. I, along with Pastor Michael, generally am going to be favorable to the position that Paul did, in fact, write Hebrews. We won't be talking that much, though, about Hebrews today. I'll mention it couple times. In addition to that, actually, Revelation, even though when we think of Revelation, we usually are always thinking end times and second coming of Christ, the beginning of the book of Revelation functions as an epistle written and directed to a group of 7 churches in the area of Asia Minor. And so much, even if you're judging by the number of books, the vast majority of the New Testament is written in the form of these epistles or letters. And these epistles could be written, they were written by one person. Typically, though, oftentimes they could have been written with the help of what we can call in fancy language an amanuensis. And an amanuensis is just a very, very fancy academic word for a secretary. This is typically, if you can imagine somebody like Paul writing a letter, it would be rare that he would have his ink and his pen and his probably vellum, animal skin that they would have been writing on, and be writing the letter himself. What was more likely to have happened is that Paul would be sitting down next to and dictating what he wanted said to somebody else who is going to be doing the writing. And typically this amanuensis, this person who's penning it, would get a credit somewhere in the letter. This is why a lot of times you'll see in the letters references to, hey, Timothy's here with me, or this is why Timothy is writing this. In Romans, at the end of Romans, in chapter 16, verse 20, you actually have a recognition to this guy Tertius, who is recognized as the one who's actually writing the letter himself. In addition to this, in some of the letters, you almost have these postscripts in the last couple verses of the letter where it's actually Paul who probably does pick up the pen and write in his own handwriting and voice, hey, this is Paul writing, I just wanted to say hi. So sometimes these letters would be written by one person, usually with the help of some kind of secretary, and they could be written either to one person, as is the case of a few of our New Testament epistles, or they were very often written to a group of people, or in this case, when we're talking about New Testament epistles, very often an entire group or a church. And when that's the case, when they're written to a group, typically these epistles would be picked up by one individual who could read, who would read what was in the letter to a gathering of the entire church. That's something to keep in mind when you're reading the epistles, is even though they are letters, especially in the case, we can leave the pastoral epistles that are written to one person aside, but these letters, even though they are letters, are really more intended to be heard than they are necessarily to be read. They're expected that they're going to be sent to a church, and then one person is going to stand up in front of the gathering of that church and read it. And most of the people are going to be hearing it. That's something to keep in mind when you're looking at what's going on. Let's see if I can move the Zoom people so I have a little bit more real estate here. All right. So I said a little bit about the form of the epistles. Let me give you an example of what exactly I mean by that in terms of the structure of what does a first century Greco-Roman letter or epistle look like. And so what we have here with a new first century epistle, we have our own conventions of how to write a letter. We open up with dear so-and-so, as I said, you have a comma, then we write the body of it, and then you usually finish off with who's writing it. Well, they have slightly different conventions according to the Greco-Roman world. They were of the impression that it's maybe a good plan or a good idea to make it clear who's writing at the very start of the letter. Maybe, they didn't have necessarily envelopes like we did, so you don't know who's this letter is being addressed from at the beginning. So, you want to state who's writing the letter right at the beginning. So you start off with the name of the writer. Then right after that, you have the name of the recipient. Then you have a greeting. Hey, how you doing? Hope things are going well. Something along those lines. Typically as well, then, that would be followed by some kind of a prayer of, I'm keeping you in my prayers. I hope things go well for you. I give thanks to you when I remember you. You've been a really big help to me. Something along those lines. That's optional. It doesn't have to be in there, but you see it in a lot of cases. Then the vast majority of the letter is, of course, going to be the body of the letter, where you get what's going on in most of it. And then finally, a statement of farewell or see ya, or this is the closing of the letter, this is the end, just to make sure the whole thing got in one piece and you know that this is, in fact, the end of the letter. And so when you look at all of the New Testament epistles, they all are going to, if they are in fact epistles, going to follow this same basic structure. You can open up to any of the New Testament epistles and you'll see this same basic format. Yeah, I'm recording. Okay. Actually, in fact, the New Testament epistles, the books of the New Testament themselves, are not the only examples of epistles that you even find in Scripture. I can show you, for the case of just showing you the basic structure of what's going on here with what an epistle looks like, what an epistle, an epistolary form or an epistolary structure looks like, because we have recorded for us in Acts one of these epistles that you probably, if you've gotten through Acts, I think some of you might be just about to or have just finished reading this. You have a letter that's actually recorded by Luke. We talked a lot last time about how Luke liked to be a real historian who was making sure he had all his T's crossed and his I's dotted and he was demonstrating his sources. Well, one of the ways Luke does that when he's writing Acts is if he mentions that a letter got written, then he's actually going to record that and say, here's the letter that was sent. And so in Acts 15, a little bit after the Council of Jerusalem, where they made the real decisions and they hashed out the arguments on what does Gentile salvation look like? What are the expectations on the Gentiles for us? They write this letter to give instructions out to the church. And notice, because it is a Greco-Roman epistle, it follows this same structure. You start out with the name of the writer. The brothers, both the apostles and the elders. So it's the apostles and the elders are writing this letter. Then you give who are the recipients. Who are we addressing this letter to? Namely, to the brothers who are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia. And then, unfortunately, it's in purple, so it might be hard for you to see, but you have the greetings, which conveniently, in the case of Acts 15, the greeting is literally just one word, greetings. Hi, how you doing? So this is what you see with the basic opening of an epistle. You'll see this in all the New Testament epistles as you're reading through. Very often, these first three parts, not going to be long, might be the first just 3 verses, might be the first 6 verses, not going to take up the bulk of the letter. That will sometimes be followed, although not necessarily. This is the piece that's optional, with some kind of a prayer, a wish, or a thanksgiving. In this example of Acts 15, you don't have that here. That was omitted for the sake of space or just because it didn't fit the context of this letter. But if you think to one of the famous examples in Philippians, a church that Paul was very close to, and he says in Philippians after his initial greetings, I thank God in all of my remembrance of you in all of my prayers. That's a good example of addressing and beginning this letter, this epistle, with one of these prayers or these wishes or these thanksgivings. Paul isn't just doing that because he believes it and he loved the Philippian church and he wanted them to know how grateful he was. Paul wanted them to know how grateful he was for their response, for their support. But in addition to that, Paul is following the general conventions of what would be expected in a Greco-Roman letter at that time. That leads into the body, which, as you can see, I won't read it all here, but that's going to make up the majority of what's going on in the letter, the actual body. This is the material of what you're looking at. And you can certainly dig more into what generally you find in that body and what maybe Paul and his writing style likes to do with the format of some of that. But then after the body, you have a final greeting or a farewell. And at the end of this, if you keep yourselves free from these, you will do well. And then you get the final greeting and farewell. Farewell. So you have here the name of the writer, the name of the recipient, the greeting, the body, and the final greeting and farewell. And this is, we know about these letters. We have more examples of them that are just in the New Testament. One of our greatest sources on Roman society and the Roman world would be, for example, the epistles written by Cicero, that follow the same exact convention as what we find in the New Testament. So these epistles are part of the broader culture and what would be expected there in the Greco-Roman world. Now, a little bit then about some of the difficulties of reading the epistles and things you need to keep your eye out for. First of all, epistles are, by their nature, deceptively simple. Part of the reason for that is our own fault, because when we think about where we as Christians, especially more evangelical Protestant Christians, tend to spend the most time in our Bible, it tends to be in the epistles. We usually are in the Gospels and the epistles far more than we are in the rest of the Old Testament or even in the book of Revelation. The epistles of the biblical material probably is going to be the material that we feel like we have a pretty good grasp on. Probably going to vary a lot from person to person, but generally the epistles we feel like we have a pretty good understanding of them. And sometimes that can lead us to not dig into them as deeply as we might expect. On top of that, because the language, you're not dealing with, like when we were back in the Old Testament, really crazy Hebrew poetry stuff. It's pretty simple prose. It can be easy for you to just get reading and you get a sense of, oh, I understand what that means, and not realize some of the layers of meaning or how context can actually inform a lot more of what's being said there. So it's very easy to take epistles for granted. You need to be careful when you're looking at them. And part of the reason for that, as I kind of just mentioned, is epistles by their very nature require you to think contextually. And you need to work to get that context, because when you're thinking about this whole practice, what you really have is one half of a conversation. You have one letter that's being sent in one direction from one author to an audience or to an individual. And actually, it's crude, but it's accurate. Reading an epistle is very much the same mental exercise as when you're in the same room or the room next door from somebody who picks up the telephone and you start eavesdropping in on that conversation. You go, I wonder who that person's talking to. I wonder what's going on in that situation. And you're, from the context clues and what you're hearing of one side of the telephone conversation, you're trying to piece together what's going on. It's really the same mental exercise that's involved to a certain degree with reading a New Testament epistle. And that means, if you can think back to that process, it's not always a perfect process. And you can quickly find that you're missing some information that can lead you to a very different conclusion than what's actually happening. And so that's why it's really important that you do your due diligence to make sure you can establish some of the occasional and the cultural and the other contextual elements that are helping to inform what's going on and what's being said and why is it being said here in this epistle. You only have half the conversation. You kind of need to always keep that in mind. So, for example, when you think contextually, when you're looking at what kind of context do we need to establish, first of all, everything that's being written down, everything that's being communicated in the letter is being written with the assumption being made by the author that there is a shared cultural and social understanding between the person who's writing and the person who's receiving the letter. Let me give you an example. You will see actually at multiple different places in the epistles, I have the list up there, references to the holy kiss. Now, we in today's worship in the 21st century do not generally in our worship practice the holy kiss. So what in the world is going on here? Paul says, greet one another with the holy kiss. Well, we kind of do this in our service today. It's just back in the Greco-Roman world, it would be completely normal and accepted in the cultural norm for you to greet friends and greet brothers with a kiss. This is the case even in the 21st century today in a lot of different cultures. My cousin Jimmy likes to always make a big deal that he's Greek, therefore it's normal and natural for him to greet people he knows with a kiss. Because in that Greek culture, even today, and going back to this time period, it would be normal for people coming from that culture and society to greet one another with a kiss. Not so much today in the 21st century culture of the West. And so, where we have that cultural understanding of Paul saying, greet one another with a kiss, he's not saying if you're a Christian, you have to greet your fellow Christian with a kiss. He's saying, greet your fellow Christian. And so, in the middle of service, at a certain appointed time in our liturgy, we at Market Street, we do it after the responsal hymn, after the sermon, we greet everyone. We say, hi, how you doing? Make sure, you give in some traditions, they say, show one another a sign of peace. That isn't necessarily going to be a kiss, but that is following in the same footsteps as this holy kiss. But when Paul gives the instruction, greet one another with a kiss, or share one with one another the holy kiss, it's understood that kissing is a generally socially understood and well-known accepted practice of greeting one another. And that is an acknowledged and understood practice that Paul would understand and that the churches he's writing to would understand. On top of that, these epistles are written to address particular problems and circumstances. And here's where things can get really specific and kind of difficult to understand. Because if you want to understand why an author of an epistle is writing something, sometimes you need to dig in and find out, hey, what's going on in that place or that group of people that they're writing to that's prompting this person to write those things. And so what that means is sometimes when instructions are given, they're occasional. And it does become up to the specific interpreter to do their due diligence, reading what they know in the cultural context and what they can see in the context of what's written to figure out whether or not that specific instruction is something that is universal for the church at all time, or if this is something that is being told specifically to one group of Christians or to one individual in order to confront and address one specific circumstance. I'll give you one broad example of this. In 1 Timothy 5:23, an example of an epistle that Paul is writing to a single person, Paul says, hey, Timothy, mix a little wine in with your water. And, if you're getting absurd, and I'm not saying any Christians do this, a lot of Christians may say, oh, what that means is all Christians, it's a sign of being a Christian. You need to mix a little, anytime you have water, you need to mix a little wine in with it. Well, no, that's not what Paul's doing. Paul is writing to Timothy, knowing who Timothy is, knowing some of the circumstances of what he's dealing with, and he knows, and you can, in this case, you can kind of tell this from the context of what's being said in the letter, Timothy is having some stomach problems. He's having some gastrointestinal problems, and probably some of the reason why that's happening is because he's traveling around to different areas, and when you travel, one of the things we know is when you travel to a new area and you drink the water, sometimes it can lead to some problems. And what Paul's saying is, I think the water you're drinking might be a little dirty and might be contributing to some of the reason why you're getting a little sick. Why don't you go ahead and take the practical step of mixing in some alcoholic fermented wine that will help to take care of some of the dirtiness in the water? Because even though they didn't have germ theory, they understood that mixing in wine with water would be able to take away some of the proneness that it tended to have to make you sick. So why don't you take that practical step in order to make sure you're not having a stomach ache anymore, Timothy? And this is specific advice being given from Paul to Timothy because of a specific problem that Timothy is facing. And in this case, this letter has been preserved for us through thousands of years, through almost 2,000 years of the church. And so we become privy to and find out, hey, Timothy was in his ministry having some stomach problems. Paul told him to go mix some wine in with your water. that's not saying we have to do that. It's saying, this is a specific problem that Timothy was facing. And so we become known. Maybe if you're like me, it's kind of a fun little detail to figure out, and maybe a little bit of a grounding and something that humanizes these people a little bit. They're traveling, they're going on adventures, they're going and taking risks and going to new places. And that means they face practical problems like, hey, the water might be causing you to get a little bit sick. And we see that and elements of that when we're reading in the epistles. And when you can, pay attention, you can start to pick out little details like that when you're reading. All right. The other problem is these epistles, even though they give very good and very accurate instructions for the church and how we should run it, they deal with problems and situations in the first century Greco-Roman world that are pretty different from probably most of the problems that we're dealing with in the church today. Take, for example, the fact that the church in the apostolic age, in the first century, is going to be confronting and living side by side with Greco-Roman paganism. And so one of the things that Paul needs to deal with is try and figure out, hey, what do you do when you're living in the same city as friends of yours who are sacrificing to pagan gods and inviting you to share in these meals this food that's been dedicated to these foreign gods? What do you do with that? Now, that's not a problem that in the general 21st century we're going to be dealing with. My friend down the street is making sacrifices to Zeus, and I want to know if I am allowed to, even though he knows I'm a Christian, go and share a meal with him and spend time with him as my friend, even though this thing is taking place. What do I do in that circumstance? So you might not have to deal necessarily with what do I do with food sacrificed to idols, but that doesn't mean that you do not take the extra logical step and find out what's the principle going on behind here. What is the principle that Paul is following in this instruction that does apply to me even in a 21st century Western society? So a little bit more on that in a moment. I'll say what that means. But here's been kind of judging and building off of those difficulties. What's some general advice for reading epistles? First of all, and this is the initial practical advice I'll offer you, read them in one sitting. I cannot repeat this enough. Epistles were, as I mentioned, something that were intended to be read by one person in the case that they were addressed to one person, or if they were addressed to a church, somebody was going to stand up in front of that church and read the letter. And they were going to read it in its entirety. You do not, when somebody writes you a letter, pick up the letter, stop halfway through, put it down, pick it up the next day, and read the letter again. You don't generally do that. Why? Because it's a letter, and the form and the genre of a letter does not really lend itself to put this down, pick it back up. You'll lose a sense or an understanding of the letter. It's not really polite. It's not nice. So I really encourage you, and I cannot say this enough, when you read an epistle, read the epistle in its entirety in one sitting. Now, I know, especially when it comes to the really long epistles, like Romans or First Corinthians, this is a burden. Romans, especially, is a long one, 16 chapters, and that's a tough one to get through in one sitting. Still, I encourage you to do so. Get through it in one sitting. Once you're through that first one, then you can move forward. But it's really important that you sit down and you read the letter in its entirety from beginning to end. Because remember, just like I kind of mentioned earlier, these epistles are following in a basic structure. And so you will pick up on more and you will have a better sense of the context. And I already said that context is very important if you read the entire epistle in one sitting. You will lose context and you will lose ability to understand exactly what's going on if you put the epistle down for a day and pick it back up on the next day. So do yourself a favor, do it all in one sitting. Now, on top of that, and this is, even though I'm going to make this very clear for future readings, I'm not necessarily telling you this for our Read the Bible in a Year, where our main goal is to read the Bible from cover to cover. But I am telling you this for the future, which is epistles. Not only do you want to read them all in one sitting, if you're really going to do a good job with an epistle, you really got to read the whole thing in one sitting, put it down for a minute or two, reflect on it, pick it back up and read the whole thing again. And that's a lot to ask, especially with Romans. That's maybe a little bit too much with Romans, but especially if you have a shorter epistle, something like the size of Ephesians or Philippians, we really encourage you to do this, because you will get a sense of the rhythm and the context, and you will pick up on far more if you are able to read the same epistle twice in a row like that. It really does help with the context. So when it comes to epistles, and you might, if you really want to be intense, you might give these same rules to some of the other books of scripture as well. But when it comes to epistles especially, read them in one sitting, read them multiple times. All right. On top of that, additional practical advice for reading epistles. Before you dive into an epistle, do a little homework. This lends to some of the cultural context and some of the social context and what's going on with the church. Because, as I said, the occasion of what's being dealt with, and I'll give you a little information when I go through each of the epistles, is going to be significant for what's being talked about and why it's being talked about. So if you can help to fill in some of those gaps, it's going to give you a lot better footing. If you are eavesdropping on somebody's conversation and you have no idea what's going on in that person's life, or you have no idea what's happening in that person's life, or who they're dealing with, you have no possible hope of figuring out what's going on in that phone conversation by eavesdropping on one side. If you're a good close family member, if you're a spouse or your child or somebody else you're really close to, or a friend you spend a lot of time with, is talking on the phone and you only hear one side of it, if you have a lot more of that understanding of who they are and what's going on, chances are a lot better you're going to pick up, oh, I know what that conversation is. I know who they're talking to. I know what's going on. And your goal with the epistles is to have that additional context, so you can start to pick up on the conversation. You can go, oh, I see why that's being said. I see what's going on here. And so to help you with that, you have as a little bit of help most of your Bibles, especially if you have study Bibles, but even most regular Bibles are going to have a little bit of a blurb at the beginning of the epistles. Read it. It'll give you a little bit of insight at the very least to what the circumstances of that epistle are and why it's being written. Commentaries as well. If you want to take a quick peek into a short, accessible commentary, they can give you a little bit of insight into what's going on. But that additional little piece of information that's not necessarily going to be offered to you in the actual body of the epistle is going to help you so much when it comes to getting a little bit more and helping you to understand more of what's going on in this epistle. It's part of the whole practice, and it's part of the reason why reading an epistle can be deceptively simple, but when you take these extra steps, you can get so much more out of the process of reading it. Now, I alluded to this a little bit earlier on the previous slide, but when you're reading a lot of this material, and even when you're reading something like, taking the example I just looked at with eating food sacrificed to idols, you might read that and you might go, oh, I don't need to spend too much attention to this because I'm never going to find myself in a situation where I'm potentially dealing with people who are sacrificing to idols. I am unlikely, not impossible, but it's unlikely that I'm going to find myself in that situation. But this is why when you're reading the epistles, it's important to keep your ear towards the principle of the instruction. Don't just look at what's being said about whether or not I do or do not eat food sacrificed to idols. Look at the why. Look at what principles are guiding Paul to say you should not eat food sacrificed to idols. And here is why. Because those principles are going to be much more likely to inform how you live your Christian life, even in the 21st century. Take, for example, why does Paul say don't eat food sacrificed to idols? Well, one of those reasons is, as Christians, we're held to a higher, holier standard, and we should not be seen doing things which can be perceived as potentially demonic. It looks like it undermines who we are and our identity as Christians. But here's a really interesting little principle that Paul takes from his instruction here. Because when he's talking to the Corinthians and he's saying, be careful about eating food sacrificed to idols, the justification he gives for it is, look around and realize that in the church with you are a lot of very, very young Christians, people who are new to the faith. And when they look at you and they see you eating food to idols, you might say, I know that there are no such things as these pagan gods. There's no power in them. It's a meaningless sacrifice. I can participate in it without any problem. But you might understand that. But the younger new Christian is going to look at you and go, is he hedging his bets? Is that person maybe making sure that they're in good with Jesus and the Lord of the Jews, but they're also making sure that they're, covering their bases with the pagan gods as well? And that can start to shake them in their faith as well. It can lead to a stumbling block, a little bit of a scandal. And so the principle Paul's drawing from this is you have to, if you're going to be a Christian, be mindful of how your fellow brothers and sisters in the faith, the other people in the church, especially those younger Christians, are reacting to and seeing what you're doing. And it might not have anything to do with sacrificing food to idols, but that is very informative for how am I to conduct myself as a Christian today. One of the expectations for me to live my Christian walk is that I need to be mindful that other Christians are looking at me. And I need to be careful of, even if I understand why I'm doing something and why what I'm doing is not bad, that might be misinterpreted by the other people around me. And I am, in some sense, responsible for the faith of my brothers and sisters and not putting them in positions where their faith may be compromised, even if it's an act that doesn't look like it's anything wrong to me. And so you can't just blank out on, I'm not going to deal with food sacrificed to idols. You need to be mining for those principles and trying to understand, hey, what's the principle guiding this? Because we might be talking about something that they were dealing with back in the first century of the church, but which I'm never going to see today. But that doesn't mean that I don't have lessons that can be learned in this situation. On top of that, you need to note when epistles instructions appear to be colored by occasional, so circumstances that are one occasion is causing this to be said, or other cultural circumstances. Again, we can go to Corinthians, and here's one of the kind of classical examples that a lot of people pull up, especially when we're dealing with a lot of questions on gender in the modern church. In Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, we have instructions telling the church in Corinth that women are supposed to have their heads covered in worship. And so one of the big questions then you have is, why don't Christians today why don't Christians who are women today, when they're worshiping, when they come to church, have their head covered? Now, some, especially more traditional, you go to some real Orthodox churches, some real hardline Catholic traditionals, you will see women wearing scarves and etc. in order to be in obedience to what's read here in Corinthians. But the reason why the church for most of its history has recognized that that is not a command that is applicable necessarily to us. And the reason why all churches don't tell women you have to wear a head covering if you're going to be in a sanctuary is because we look at the culture and the society of Corinth and we see, hey, it was expected in Corinth for married women to have their head covered. It was an expectation of modesty. And so what Paul's saying here is not women who are Christians need to have their head covered. He's saying it is expected that Christians will be in accordance and not violate the cultural and the social norms of modesty that are expected of them in the church. And so in Corinth, it's expected that married women should have their heads covered. What we don't want to have happen is suddenly the church starts making this big stand about married women don't have to have their heads covered in worship. And therefore now all the city of Corinth is starting to get into an uproar about all these Christians who are starting to challenge the cultural and the social norm. No, Paul's saying, keep your head covered. We're going in line with this cultural norm. On top of that, go further, a lot of Christians have said, it was the expectation not only that married women would have their head covered and would generally have a full head of hair under that, but that prostitutes in that cultural circumstance would have their head in shame shaved. And Paul's recognizing that the young, dynamic Corinthian church, we'll say more about them in a couple of slides, is dealing with the fact where some of the married women are looking around and they know they have full heads of good-looking hair. And some of the prostitutes who have recently joined the church and are reaching out to the gospel are sitting there with shaved heads, and they're getting judged. They're starting to feel like you're on the outside. And the letter to the Corinthians has a whole lot, as we'll mention in a moment, to say about Christians not ostracizing other Christians and not putting different Christians on different tiers or making some Christians better than others, but all being equal in the faith. And so one of the reasons why Paul is almost certainly giving this instruction to say, Corinthian church, women need to keep their heads covered, is because he wants to remove that element of judgment of married women looking down on prostitutes and saying, look, I have a full head of hair, you're shaved, I'm better than you. And so how do you remove that? Heads covered. We're making the church equal. And again, that leads to, on top of this, of understand the occasion, of when you realize that all of this instruction of, hey, Corinthian church, you're starting to make a lot of your church members better than other people. And that's not the way it's supposed to go. You're not supposed to all be members of the church going, I'm a better Christian than you. I live my life better than you. I'm up here. I sit at the better part of the church. I get communion served to me first, etc., etc. You're missing the boat. Stop starting to alienate one another. Get one another on the same plane. Start to view one another as brothers and sisters. And when you start to realize that that's the ongoing theme and context of a lot of this letter of 1 Corinthians, because even though it's a long letter, you're sitting down and reading the whole thing at once, then you can start to realize, oh, that's why Paul is making this instruction of telling women, keep your heads covered. And that's also why the church, looking back on this, can understand that Paul is being inspired to write this. And that does not necessarily mean all women need to always have their heads covered in worship. But it is addressing this specific circumstance of there's problems going on in the church of Corinth. How do we solve those problems? We keep heads covered. And so that's what we see going on here. And it's one of the reasons why you can read instructions and you can take a very simple approach to a lot of it. But at the same time, they're deceptively simple. You need to do that extra work to figure out what's going on. And by the way, you need to do it diligently, because it's very easy on the other side for a lot of people to start making a lot of arguments to say, you know what, we're going to do a little exegetical or hermeneutical gymnastics. And we're going to figure out how we can make all of these instructions that we don't like, that are maybe a little convicting to us, make them occasional for only certain circumstances. And so you need to do your due diligence. And it takes good, hard effort and a lot of wisdom to be able to figure out what's this instruction and what's really being meant here. And it's the task of reading scripture. Okay, let's get to the types of New Testament epistles. And this will give a little bit, I just put together this kind of rough chart for a little bit of what I'm saying and what we're going to be looking at before I jump into a little bit on who Paul is and then some of what we see in the epistles that we'll be taking a look at. I've already mentioned and I've already alluded to the fact that the epistles can first be divided between what we call the Pauline epistles, generally earlier in the New Testament, and then what we can call the general or the Catholic epistles. Catholic here, by the way, is not in reference to the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of people have negative reactions when they see that word Catholic, depending upon their history with the Catholic Church. In this term, the term Catholic in this context just means universal. So it's a synonym for general. So the general epistles simply is a term to say they're written in many cases to a more general audience, but they're also written by somebody who isn't Paul. Now, I know it's confusing because I'm going to introduce a term and then immediately contradict it, because I hold the line, I hold the view that even though it is traditionally organized as a general or a Catholic epistle, Hebrews is a Pauline epistle. It is authored by Paul. It's given to a more general Jewish audience, hence why it can be considered a general epistle. But I think Hebrews is written by Paul. Now, on the other side of that, we have all the Pauline epistles, and there are a whole bunch of different schemes for how you can organize the Pauline epistles. I'm going to give you two additional categories and then one catch-all category for the rest of them. The first is that what we can call the prison epistles of Paul. And these are simple. The prison epistles are named as such because they are epistles that Paul wrote while he was imprisoned somewhere. And so it's important to note these prison epistles. They are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And they are going to take on a certain character and a certain focus for the simple reason that Paul is writing them while things are maybe not going that well and he's stuck in prison. And so there's going to be a general focus on suffering when it comes to the prison epistles. And how do we suffer well? And what does our suffering mean for Christians? And how do we put our suffering in context with the gospel? And why, if I'm doing the right thing and I'm becoming a Christian, is my life getting harder? And why are things getting difficult for me? A lot of information to be found there about those things in the prison epistles because Paul's writing them while he's in prison. Of the prison epistles as well, we can make a quick note that Philemon, though it is a prison epistle, Paul's writing it while he's in prison. Philemon stands out because it is a Pauline epistle that is being written to an individual. Pastoral epistles are also written to individuals. These are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And the pastoral epistles are interesting because they are written to individuals. And in the case of these Pauline pastoral epistles, they are written to individuals, Timothy, 2 letters to Timothy, and 1 to Titus. These are individuals who are leaders in the church. So Paul is going to write an epistle to them saying, here's what's going on in the church. Here's some advice I'm giving you about how do you lead the church well. Here's how you address some of the problems that you're facing wherever you're at and with what's going on there. So those pastoral epistles take on a certain character because they're written to individuals about, and they're called pastoral epistles. How do you pastor the flock well? How do you serve well as a leader of the church? And then our catch-all, which I guess we can just call these church epistles because they're written to entire churches in all cases. These are just some other epistles that Paul wrote to entire churches. You have 1 to the church in Rome, 2 to the church in Corinth, 1 to the church in Galatia, and then 2 to the church in Thessalonians. So those are the New Testament epistles. As you can see, the majority of them are written by this one individual who we know by the name of Paul, the Apostle Paul. And it actually serves us well in Scripture that the book of Acts, especially the second half of the book of Acts, really serves as an introduction to the person of Paul and who he was and what he did, because right when you finish the book of Acts, you're going to go into a whole bunch of letters that he's writing. But before we get into the Pauline epistles themselves, and I start the speed run of what do we say about each of these individual epistles, let's say a little bit about Paul and who he is. So Paul is born in Tarsus, which Tarsus is, I'll show you a map in a few slides, but I won't go there. If you can think of, my hand is Turkey here, and then kind of here is going down through Syria and down to Israel. Tarsus is kind of right here in the corner of where they meet, right in the shoulder, right at the bottom, kind of bottom right, so southeast of what's today Anatolia, Turkey, on the coast of the Mediterranean. And Tarsus was significant because it was a pretty well-known city. There was a pretty strong intellectual tradition. This is not like some backwater that Tarsus was, some backwater nowhere. Paul was coming from a pretty reputable city. Some big events had happened in Tarsus. You know, Tarsus was where, if you're a geek about Roman history, Mark Antony and Cleopatra met in Tarsus. If you ever hear any cultural references to the beauty and the ornate nature of Cleopatra's incredible barge, Cleopatra's barge that she impressed Mark Antony with, Cleopatra's barge was made to impress Mark Antony while he was at the city of Tarsus. So Tarsus is not some nowhere. It's a place where a lot of history had happened. And on top of that, Paul is, as we should remember from the events of the book of Acts, a Roman citizen. probably a Roman citizen because his father I believe his father served in the Legion. And if you serve in the Legion, your reward is citizenship for yourself and for your children. And so Paul is going to have the credit and the prestige and the honor of being a Roman citizen, something that he is going to leverage very importantly in the events that we have recorded in the book of Acts, because it is because Paul is a Roman citizen that he's able to legally make that appeal directly to Caesar that's going to lead to him eventually making his way to Rome. On top of that, and here's actually where we can get a lot of information from that very useful and very memorable passage in Philippians where Paul gives kind of all of his credentials before saying they're all pointless next to the surpassing worth of the gospel. But we know that Paul is Jewish. Specifically, actually, he takes pride in the fact that he is of the tribe of Benjamin. So we know that at least to some degree, they were doing the work of holding on to, figuring out what tribe am I from that point. Actually, it's significant that he's from the tribe of Benjamin because Paul shares a little bit of a loose connection. Paul's original name back when he's kind of persecuting the church is what? Saul. Who's the other Saul that we know connected to Benjamin? King Saul. So obviously there's probably a connection there of Paul and Saul. Therefore, Paul is very proud to be of the tribe of Benjamin. He considers it an honorable lineage, which is kind of interesting to think about if you remember way back to what happened to Benjamin at the end of the book of Judges. But nevertheless, it's the tribe where the first king came from, even if that king didn't turn out to be so good. And it's also a tribe that stood strong. It's the tribe that stuck with Judah, even when all the northern kingdoms were going away in rebellion in the split that would lead to the northern and southern kingdom. So Paul was quite proud to be from the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Pharisee, which means, we give the Pharisees a very hard we give them a bad rep. Part of that's because the Gospel of Matthew especially is very hard on the Pharisees. But if you are a Pharisee, you knew your Bible well. You knew your Old Testament like the back of your hand. In fact, you would memorize vast swaths. In fact, your goal would be to memorize the entirety of the Torah. And so you knew your Bible, you knew your Old Testament well if you were a Pharisee. In fact, Paul had the prestige of studying under Rabbi Gamaliel. Rabbi Gamaliel is, even to this day, a well-known figure in Judaism. He is mentioned in the Talmud. On top of that, he not only does Paul appeal to Gamaliel in his credentials saying, yeah, I studied under Gamaliel in Acts, because he expects people are going to know who Gamaliel is. He's pretty famous. But actually, Gamaliel is well known in Judaism. The church actually claims Gamaliel. I'll go a little bit on a side to some church tradition. But Gamaliel is a well-known Jew. He has this really interesting moment in the book of Acts where the church is about to start the persecution of the church is about to continue, and a lot of people are going to start attacking some of the apostles who are preaching. And Gamaliel steps in and he says, no. Stop persecuting these guys, because in the logic that Gamaliel gives, and he's noticed in Acts, he's portrayed in a very good light. He basically says, if these people are serious and Jesus Christ is the Messiah, there's nothing you can do to stop them. Their word's going to get through. On the other hand, if they are not from the Messiah, if Jesus was not the Messiah, they're going to fail. You don't need to persecute them. They're going to go away. They'll disappear. Their whole movement will be meaningless. And if they are right, then, man, you really don't want to end up being the one who's persecuting them. So it's interesting that Gamaliel in the book of Acts is put in a very good light as somebody who actually stepped in and said, no, let these people talk. Let's see where they're going. And the church holds the tradition, even though Gamaliel to this day is held up by Judaism as being a very good and very accurate teacher of Torah, the church says at the very end of his life, Gamaliel converted and acknowledged the truth of the gospel and that Jesus Christ was Lord. In fact, the traditional, and I think it's probably, I tend to give the benefit of the doubt, even though that's just me, but I think this is accurate. The traditional location of the burial of Gamaliel is in a Catholic monastery in a place called Beit Jimel. It's just outside of Jerusalem. I visited it. But Gamaliel he is in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. He is considered a saint. But Gamaliel is, all of that to say, in both Judaism and in the early church, Gamaliel was a big deal. So when Paul says, I studied under Gamaliel, that's a statement of honor of I studied under the absolute best of the best. I'm not just some like second-rate guy. I know my stuff and I studied under the best. We of course know from Acts that he was persecuting the church up until he has his dramatic experience on the Damascus Road, when Jesus Christ himself appears shining to Paul and says, Paul, why, Saul, why are you persecuting me? By the way, excuse me, got something in my throat. This appearance of Christ to Paul, leading to his conversion, is the reason why Paul can rightly claim the title of apostle, of one who was sent. Even though he's not one of the 12, he did see the risen Christ, in his case, miraculously. And because of that, he was sent by Jesus to go stop persecuting the church and start spreading the word of the gospel. In his case, he acknowledges by the end of Acts, his job is specifically to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and especially moving to the west towards Rome. And Paul, Paul made it as far as he went and worshiped. He went and spread the gospel and ministered in Spain. So he does his job. He makes it all the way to the other side of the Mediterranean. Actually, if you keep your eyes peeled when you're reading through Romans, at the end of Romans, he makes a note of, I'm on my way over to see you, church in Rome. My intention is to go visit Rome. And then after I've done my business in Rome, I'm going to go over to Spain and minister there. There's some debate on whether or not he actually made it to Spain or not. It depends upon whether or not you believe Paul only went to Rome once, or if he kind of went to Rome, went somewhere else, and then came back, because he is going to die in Rome. I think I give complete legitimacy. I think he made it out to Spain. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't have made it out to Spain. I think in that case, I think the majority of scholars would say he probably did make it out to Spain. There's a lot of, even though it's not scripture, tradition of saying this is where Paul visited in Spain. So I think he made it out there. Paul made his way around. If Hebrews is included, as I said, he wrote 14 epistles if you include Hebrews. If you include Hebrews, which is a longer epistle, over a third of the New Testament is penned by Paul himself. So that's a significant chunk. Paul is going to end up beheaded by the Romans during the persecution of Nero. So the Neronic persecutions, which are going to be a big event, some of you may be aware, Rome catches fire. Nero famously is about to take the blame for it. I don't think, by the way, in my reading of Roman history, I don't think Nero set fire to Rome. That's my opinion. There's evidence to say that he did. I think it's a little bit of a conspiracy theory to say that Nero did, and I don't think it holds weight. Nevertheless, Nero knew that a lot of people were starting to whisper that he had set fire to or started a fire that had burned down a good portion of Rome, and realizing he didn't want to take the hit, he decided to start blaming this new group of people called Christians that have started to appear in Rome, and starts persecuting the church in mass, even to the point where famously Nero, in order to make an example of the Christians in his palace, started setting up torches. You can think of them like tiki torches, but he would burn Christians in order to keep his palace lit. So you can imagine how bad those persecutions were. It was under those persecutions with Nero that Peter was going to end up crucified, traditionally crucified upside down. Paul, remember, Paul is a Roman citizen. Because he is a Roman citizen, it is not legal to crucify him. Because of that, he gets the more dignified execution of beheading. Hence why Paul is beheaded, not crucified. But that's how Paul meets his end, probably somewhere around 67 AD. Now, let's go ahead and jump into, and we'll see how far I get. I might not make it all the way to 2 Thessalonians, depending on how much time we have left. We get about 20 minutes, so we'll see how far we get. Let's say a little bit about all of the epistles. And like I said earlier, one of your duties, one of the things you need to do in your due diligence to read an epistle effectively and well, is find out what's the circumstances, what's the occasion of why this letter is being written, and also maybe pay attention to what's the context of what are some of the big themes that we're really trying to hammer home here. And so hopefully with some of this, even though I'll highlight a few really important passages that I'll say, take note of these as you move through them. Really, my goal here is going to be to give you these dates and some of these occasions of why is this being written, because I think that's important background for helping you to get more out of what's going on with these epistles. So the first epistle, after you finish up with Acts, is Romans. Romans is the chunkiest of the epistles. And it's really being written around, if we're going to date it, around 57 AD from Corinth. Yeah, question?
So Jesus died at 33 AD, so it's like 24 years later.
Yep.
Is this written before or after any of the Gospels?
Most of the epistles, great question. For context, first of all, it was said Jesus died in 33 AD. Yes. In fact, I don't know if I've said this before on one of my lectures. Maybe I'll do it sometime later. But I think if you do your detective work and you actually figure out one, looking at the Jewish calendar and also looking at a few other pieces of evidence, I think you can figure out the exact day that Jesus was crucified. We don't have any idea when he was born. We don't have enough evidence to actually confirm what day or what year he was born. But if you do your evidence, I'm going to go ahead and make the stand. And before I say it, recognize I think this is a coincidence, especially because obviously the calendar didn't exist yet, so it has to be a coincidence. Jesus died at 3:00 p.m. on April 3rd of 33 AD. That's the reality of the situation. That's, if you do your math, I think I can say with 95% certainty, 3:00 in the afternoon on April 3rd of 33 AD. That's when Jesus was crucified. Now that means that most of these epistles are going to be written somewhere in the time frame of, I'm going to go earliest 48 AD to latest being about 66, 67. What that means is the epistles are going to be written first, is what I'm going to say. The epistles in general are being written first. The Gospels, I mentioned, are really going to come around because a lot of the apostles are looking around and they're starting to realize that a lot of the apostles and eyewitnesses are starting to die and they need to write things down for future generations. And so because of that, most of the Gospels, I'm going to say, are going to happen closer to 70 AD. I took the stance of I don't think any gospel can be written after 70 AD because of the destruction of the temple. And even though a lot of scholars will say they had to be written after 70 AD, I think the Gospels would have said something about the destruction of the temple if they were in fact written after 70 AD. So I'm going to say Gospels are written somewhere in the 65 to 70 AD range. In fact, maybe a little bit earlier. I'll kick that 65 out. But the epistles are written somewhere in the 48 to 69 range. So certainly, even though some of the later epistles are going to overlap with the Gospels, the early epistles are going to be the earliest material. In fact, I'll take a note. Depending upon how you deal with the dating of Galatians, the oldest books we have in the New Testament are either Galatians, which is what I hold, or First Thessalonians. That's the oldest book. You don't think about, hey, what's the first book to be written in the New Testament? And you certainly wouldn't probably jump to Galatians and First Thessalonians being the earliest, but that's the answer. I would say it's probably Galatians. I think a lot of people would say Galatians is a little bit later and say First Thessalonians, but I'll actually mention that when I get through Galatians and First Thessalonians, which it's increasingly looking like I maybe won't get to First Thessalonians today. But looking at Romans, and good question, AD 57 probably written from Corinth, and we can get some of that context actually not only from passages that are written in Romans, but also from something in First Corinthians as well. And Romans is going to be written to the church in Rome, hence why the name, as is the case. Most of the epistles are just named after wherever they're addressed to. But Paul is going to be sending a letter forward with a deaconess, yes, a woman deacon, by the name of Phoebe, who had already been in Rome, but met up with Paul and said, here's what's going on in the church in Rome. I know you're on your way to Rome. And Paul, knowing that he was on his way to Rome, even though he's in Corinth at this point, knowing that he wanted to visit Rome at some point, is going to send a letter ahead of him, hoping to kind of say a little bit of an introduction to who he is and what he's saying. So kind of a initial pamphlet saying, here's what I'm preaching, here's what I believe. So you can have your footing when I come and I actually start preaching. But also, one of the things that Phoebe was telling him about was that there were starting in the Roman church to be a lot of butting of heads at that point between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. And maybe some of the Gentile Christians being a little anti-Semitic and saying the Jews are weird, and some of the Jews coming back and saying, well, we're in obedience with the law, and we are the chosen people, and we're better than you are. And the Jews and the Gentiles are not getting along. And so Paul is not only going to want to give his initial statements on who he is and what he believes, but he's also going to want to address some of that conflict that's going on between Jews and Gentiles and Romans. And so this is one of the reasons why in Romans you have such a focus on the fact that the law is good, but also that the law cannot save you, and also that Israel is the vine, but also that the Gentiles have been grafted onto that same vine, and some of the information about what's being said about Jews. Why is Paul including all of that information in Romans? It's because he's trying to address these ongoing issues he's starting to hear about from Phoebe, that people are not getting along in the Roman church, and he wants to fix that. Romans, of course, really, I don't know, I'm going to just come out and say, Romans probably, especially for the evangelical Christian tradition that we're part of, Romans is probably the most influential book in the Bible. You might say that that's a problem and that we need to give more focus elsewhere. But if there's one book that really governs who we are and what we do, more so than any other book in the Bible, it's probably Romans. And that's because it's in Romans that you really find that element of the law convicting you and you being dead in your trespasses and sins, and then the gospel coming along and in Christ alone being justified and receiving salvation. And justification by grace through faith really comes through so strong and so clearly in the letter to the Romans. This is why it's Martin Luther who realizes in his Tower experience that element of justification by faith alone by reading Romans and by looking into Romans and realizing, and it's Romans that sparks the entire Protestant Reformation, because it's found there so clearly in Paul's theology. You also have elements of the transformation of the mind by the Spirit, and the fact that, hey, just because you're justified by faith and not by works doesn't mean that works isn't going to come alongside. One of the elements and one of the ways that you see that faith is real, and James is really going to hammer this in, is there's a change that happens in your heart. You can't continue to sin if your heart's really been changed. And so Romans really does stand out. Not only is it the longest, but it is kind of the most complete and systematic presentation of Paul's theology that we find anywhere in the letters. It is significant in that regard. It's why it gets so much attention. And it makes sense that it would be the longest letter, because more so than maybe any other letter, remember that Paul is sending this one ahead of him to the church in Rome, to an audience who doesn't necessarily know who he is. And so that's why Paul needs to be more complete. There's not a whole series of sermons that he's already delivered that he's just clearing up and reminding them of certain elements. He's kind of laying it all out in a more complete picture. And that's why Romans is longer, and why it gives us this more complete presentation of Paul's theology. That leads us to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians also very, very important letter that gets a lot of attention. Corinthians, notice the dating a little bit earlier than Romans, probably written somewhere around AD 53 to 54 from the city of Ephesus. And Paul really is going to be, in the letter to the Corinthians, responding to reports and letters that he's receiving regarding a lot of trouble and different discord and strife that he's starting to hear about in a very young and dynamic Corinthian church. And actually, before I jump into giving you the history of the Corinthian church a little bit. Before I jump into giving you some of the themes in the letter to the Corinthians, let me say a little bit about the history of the Corinthian church, because I think it gives you a better insight, again, illustrating some of my points of what I said earlier, that understanding the history of some of these cities and the occasions of why these letters are being written will help you to much better grasp what's being said and why it's being said. And the Corinthian church, as I mentioned here, is really a very young, it's a new church, and it's very dynamic. It's almost, if I'm to put it, think of Corinth as an inner city church. It's an inner city church where you have a lot of diverse, different people from different backgrounds, and people are coming and going very quickly, and they're always confronted with the newest kind of progressive ideas at any given point. That's the environment of the church in Corinth. It's a very metropolitan church of mostly, although not entirely, Gentiles. And if you understand more about Corinth and what it is and what its place in history is, you get a better sense of why it's like this. Why is the church so young and dynamic, and you have so many different groups of people that it's easy for divisions to start cropping up between rich and poor, between Greek and Roman, between various ethnic groups? Why are those barriers going to start coming up, and why is it so young and dynamic of a church? Well, Corinth is, if you can read this map right here, it's kind of, if you see Greece here, Athens is here, Thessaloniki, by the way, the letter to the Thessalonians is going to be up here, another very important port city. But Corinth is a city strategically located right between what we call Attica, the peninsula here, and the Peloponnesian peninsula. And it's kind of right here on this isthmus of Corinth, this very narrow stretch of land. And that's some very significant real estate. And here's why. Back during this time period, sailing was far from an easy or guaranteed circumstance. It was a risky business. And being a sailor who knew what you were doing was a commodity, it was a skill that was in high demand, to say the least. And one of the things that they understood was that this sea territory right here on this map, kind of south of the Peloponnese Peninsula and going out towards Sicily, was some really dangerous stretch of water, because you were far out enough in the water, you were far out enough in the Mediterranean that you didn't really see land anywhere. And you didn't have GPS or anything, and magnets weren't really a thing. So you didn't quite know where you were. Once you were out this far and you didn't see land anymore, you were taking a big risk. Also, a lot of storms and high waves there. So when you venture out into this territory right here, you can do it, but it's risky. And you can actually know that it's risky because you remember that it was right around in this territory heading towards Sicily and near the island of Malta, that's kind of over here a little bit off this map. Paul was shipwrecked on his way to Rome in Acts. So you know that it's a risky territory because you even have an example of a shipwreck happening around here in the Bible. So one of the things that they quickly realized that was a lot safer to do would be to stick closer to land. And rather than go all the way around the Peloponnese Peninsula here, which is very risky, you could dip into this waterway, go off, unload your boat in Corinth, walk across the city of Corinth, which, as you can see in this picture, not very far, and load up another boat. And then you could just, stick close to land and you'd be in the Aegean, close to a lot of islands. And it was a lot safer route. And the city of Corinth during this time period in the first century is going to get tremendously wealthy as essentially the crossroads between the Eastern and the Western Mediterranean, meaning a lot of people are coming and going at any various times. One of the reasons why, if you're Paul, you definitely want to establish and set a church up in Corinth, because there's a lot of people coming and going from a lot of different parts. In fact, as you can see from a map, this kind of passage over the city of Corinth was so well known that going back as far as ancient Greece, one of the things that the Greeks constantly talked about was building a canal through Corinth, a Corinthian canal. Nero, the guy we talked about earlier, actually very famously was the first one to attempt the Corinthian canal. In fact, he used a lot of Jews to help build and try and build the canal. that he had captured in the Jewish revolt that would eventually lead to the destruction of the temple later on after Nero. And so Corinth, this stretch of road, was such an important crossroads in terms of maritime travel that people were talking about building a canal. And Nero, even around this time, a little bit after the Corinthian church is receiving this letter, is going to end up being the site of a canal. Now, Nero doesn't finish his canal. It's actually not until the late 19th century, when Greece wins its independence from the Ottoman Empire, that they're going to take up a building project of finishing the Corinthian canal. That's why today, actually continuing in the same stretch of land that Nero had carved out, you have a Corinthian canal here. But the very presence of the canal indicates just how important of a kind of crossroads here Corinth is, that it's worth the economic and the labor investment to build a canal, so you don't have to take the risk of going around all the way here. Now, with modern GPS and modern navigation techniques, and also with how large ships have gotten, the Corinthian canal doesn't get a lot of use a lot today. It's still around, you can go see it, but that's what you see in Corinth. But the fact that you have all that dynamics gives way to this very metropolitan church, where you can imagine Paul is writing to this Corinthian community that has a lot of people coming and going at various points. And so there's going to be a lot of various competing views coming and going, a lot of different gods being talked about, a lot of various groups in a very kind of large church that's very diverse, where people are constantly trying to find different ways to separate one another. Just like you have in cities today, you have the very, very, very wealthy in close proximity to the very, 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 very poor. And so all of these problems, kind of very similar to a lot of inner city churches, are going to be the same problems that the Corinthian church are dealing with, what Paul is writing this letter to. So the emphases that Paul is going to be focusing on is the crucified Christ as wisdom and power. And when you're talking about this, this is significant, because something we maybe don't think about too much because we've been conditioned is crucifixion is the most pathetic, disgusting form of execution you can imagine. Only the lowest form of criminal would ever die by crucifixion. That's a little bit of a barrier when you're the early church and you're trying to communicate, yeah, we have a savior, a Messiah, the one who forgave all your sins. He died by crucifixion. That's a hard pill. That's a hard bill of goods to sell. So Paul, knowing that this is a very Gentile, very metropolitan, very Roman city, is going to have to start to explain and show how, paradoxically, the cross is this symbol of immense honor and this symbol of salvation. Also, conforming Christian behavior to the gospel. We should start behaving in appearance with the gospel. And as I've been alluding to a lot already, the unity of all believers in the Spirit. Some of you may be very rich, some of you may be very poor. You're all brothers and sisters in Christ. Stop saying that you're only giving communion, or you're giving the best seat in the communion table when you celebrate it, to the very wealthy and the people who can donate a lot to the church. Stop doing that. I know it's a risk for you guys, because I know the circumstances you're living in, Corinthian church, but figure it out. Don't do that. On top of that, if I'm going to start one of the kind of the first big passage that I'm going to say keep your eye out for, Paul knows, because Greco-Romans had a lot of problems with the idea of resurrection in the body. Because if you're a Greek caught up in Greek philosophy, and the Romans are going to get caught alongside with this, the body was naturally bad. And so why would you ever want to be resurrected in the body? That sounds like we're going in the wrong direction. We want to get more spiritual, less body. And so Paul is going to spend some time clarifying, you are going to be resurrected. You're going to be resurrected just like Christ was, with a body. And so it will be a bodily resurrection. And one of the, maybe the best passages explaining the resurrection of the body is chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, one to keep your eye out for. So that's a little bit on 1 Corinthians. I'll run through 2 Corinthians, and we'll leave it with 2 Corinthians, recognizing that time is drawing short. So 2 Corinthians, notice, just about a year later after 1 Corinthians, it's kind of a follow-up letter. Paul probably isn't in Ephesus anymore. He's moved on, if we follow him along. and he's probably in Macedonia. We can maybe guess more specific. We know from what he says in the letter that he's in Macedonia. We can probably take the guess that he's probably specifically in Philippi at this point. But Paul in 2 Corinthians, this is a follow-up letter, is going to continue to correct and help the Corinthian church to mature. It's a young church. He wants them to grow in the ways of Christ. After he starts receiving about a year later some reports from a guy named Titus that things are still a little bit problematic, even though he gives good reports that things are going well in the Corinthian church. And to give another message before Paul knows he's going to be returning to the Corinthian church, and he wants to send a message out ahead of him. So 2 Corinthians is going to give a lot more information on, the Christian ministry is about suffering. It's not about just enjoying yourself and things going well. There is an element of suffering, and your suffering should reflect the suffering of Christ. Also, the power of the gospel through the weakness of its ministers, in the way that just like Christ suffered for our glory, it is to the glory of God and even to the credit of ministers that they suffer and have a hard time in their ministry. And especially for a lot of the very wealthy in Corinth, that might be a hard pill to swallow. That might not be something that they're expecting to hear. And Paul feels like he needs to clarify it. On top of that, because you have, again, very wealthy and very poor people in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians, Paul is going to give some more instructions on the nature of giving. Some, by the way, I'll mention this in passing. I don't think it's that important. Some have said that 2 Corinthians might be actually two letters spliced into one, where chapters 1 through 9 is one letter, and then you kind of have a second letter start up in chapters 10 through 13. I don't give too much attention to that necessarily. But what I do think, finishing up here for today and recognizing I'll have a lot of epistles to kind of run through 2 weeks from now, but that's fine. It'll give us something to do. 2 Corinthians especially serves as a good example for how understanding some of the cultural significance of the circumstances of this church and what's going on in the city can really give you better insight to understand, hey, what's being focused on here and why. If you do your homework and find out more about this church and some of the historical significances that are guiding some of what Paul's writing, it can give you a much better insight into how can you get more out of this style of writing these epistles. So with that said, and leaving it there for now, I'll go ahead and end the PowerPoint for now. Any questions before I end the recording? Lights coming on. Any questions, clarification, anywhere here or on Zoom?
I have one question.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Greeks at that time idolized the human form in art. And
yes.
So you're saying that they had trouble with the resurrection of the body.
Good. Yep.
That seems a contradiction.
Good. It's a good question. A lot of this is coming out of the philosophy of Plato. And to give a quick, I know time is short, but to give a crash course on the philosophy of Plato, I think it's very useful, actually. And a lot of the church used Plato significantly because they found it to work very well with a lot of the gospel message, but it can be brought to a destructive end. Everything we see on earth that's natural, that's physical, is a shadow or a corrupted version of perfect forms that exist up in the spiritual realm. Okay. And so to that end, a perfect, athletic, beautiful body can exist and point towards that perfect body that exists in the spiritual platonic form in the spiritual realm. But that doesn't mean that our goal isn't to shed the physical, shed the form, and get up to the spiritual. Okay. And so you can see how that idea of the perfect form in the perfect spiritual and the corrupted, fallen natural is actually going to fit very well into the gospel message and be very useful to the church when it's starting to spread the gospel out to the Greeks in its early form. But it can also, as Corinthians demonstrates, be brought to a corruptive end where you start to just view anything that's natural as inherently bad. And of course, we as Christians hold that God created the world and it was good. And we hold not just that the spiritual is perfect, but that there is a good nature that can be made perfected as well. And that's where there's a little bit of a departure. But nevertheless, because of that Platonic background, the Romans and the Greeks were in the mindset of the goal is to get spiritual, and we want to get rid of the natural because we want to get away from the shadow and up towards the perfect form. And so that's why they were starting to misunderstand the resurrection. That's some of the clarification that's coming in that Paul's making in 1 Corinthians 15. So, all right, great question. Any other questions? All right, that's it. Then let me end the recording here.